The date is September 18th, 1988, in Seoul, Korea. On this day, 21 nations, 24 athletes, had one chance to prove that bowling belonged on the Olympic stage. This was the big moment. After years of talk, thousands of miles traveled, everything the sport had worked towards throughout its entire history had come down to this moment. And then, it ended. One demonstration event. No real medals. No path to the real stage. Just a simple showcase that would become bowling's lone Olympic appearance. That was 37 years ago. Bowling has never been back. This is the story of the sport that failed the Olympics. Right now, the 2026 Winter Olympic Games in Milan and Cortina are in full swing. Athletes from over 90 nations are competing in sports from alpine skiing to curling to ski mountaineering. Billions all over the globe will tune in to watch at some point or another, and lifetime dreams will be satisfied. Bowling won't be there, and it probably never will be. But this doesn't make sense. Bowling is played in over 100 countries, with recognized international federations governing the sport. Professional tours exist in almost every major sporting region. Millions of people participate yearly. By almost every single standard imaginable, bowling should be under heavy consideration as an Olympic sport. But it isn't included, and it probably never will be. This is why bowling's Olympic dream died in Seoul that day in 1988, what the sport has done since to try and resurrect that dream, and why one of the world's most popular sports exists outside the Olympics, while many other new sports, like ski mountaineering and dual moguls, have all been added as events in the recent years. To understand what happened in Seoul, you need to understand how desperately the bowling team pushed for Olympic inclusion. After all, there was a ton of effort put in to even make that exhibition match happen, let alone getting close to that. The initial push for recognition on the Olympic stage started in the early 1980s. A man by the name of Gerald Koenig, a bowling industry executive, had spent years traveling the world attempting to promote the sport and encourage its Olympic participation. He had logged thousands of miles across dozens of countries, attending meetings, making presentations, and building relationships with the Olympic officials. His strategy was slow and rather methodical. For bowling to even be under consideration, it had to prove its success in many other major multi-sport events. In 1978, it did just that, becoming an official sport at the Asian Games in Bangkok. Luckily, bowling far exceeded its projected popularity, and when the Asian Games returned to Seoul in 1986, the response was even stronger. This outing in Seoul was especially crucial because they were preparing to host the 1988 Summer Olympics just 2 years after this. The organizing committee had the power to propose demonstration events. Bowling's performance at the 1986 Asian Games gave them all the evidence they needed if they wanted to make a case for bowling at the world level. In January of 1986, the Olympic Committee decided to add bowling as a demonstration sport for the Seoul Olympics. This was a massive victory for the future of the sport. The result of more than 5 years of negotiations and advocacy for the sport's inclusion. The bowling industry then poured in as many resources as physically possible to make sure that this would be the perfect outing. The International Bowling Federation spearheaded the organization of the event, and each country sent one male and one female competitor. The competition consisted of a qualifying round where bowlers would compete in an 11-game qualifying format, followed by a stepladder final where the top 3 finishers battled for the title. Unfortunately, since it was a demonstration, they would not be awarded real medals, but I'll get to that later. So, with everything settled, everything was ready for the big day in Seoul. Then, the big day came, September 18th, 1988. 21 nations participated, 12 men, 12 women. South Korea's Kwon Young-yul, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that, I'll throw it up on screen, won the men's side of the event. And on the women's side of things, the Philippines' Adriana Cerdena took home the win. Overall, the competition was professionally ran, and the events received positive coverage. And then, the event ended. There were medals awarded, although they were demonstration medals, not the official ones. They didn't count towards any nation's total overall. The event was simply exhibition, and they left it at that. It was all but a trial run to see if bowling deserved to be a real sport. Based on all that I've said so far, that answer should be a clear yes, but it wasn't. On paper, bowling checks almost every box the Olympics claim to care about. So let's go through them one by one. Let's start with participation. Bowling is played on a competitive scale across all of Asia, Europe, North America, South America, and has a growing presence in both Africa and Oceania. When Tokyo was in preparation to host the 2020 Olympics, over 1 million Japanese fans signed a petition supporting its inclusion. That's not the niche sport that many make it out to be. It's a sport with obvious appeal and deep international roots that reach far beyond the North American scale that a lot of people claim it has. The next thing is competitive structure. Bowling isn't always a recreational game pretending to be a serious sport, even though many take that position. The sport has been part of the Asian Games since 1978, the Pan American Games since 1991, and it's been at almost every single World Games since the very first edition in 1981. These are major international stages with rigorous standards, very similar to the Holy Grail that is the Olympics. However, athletic requirements are where things hit a bit of a bump in the road, so to speak. There's a misconception that bowling isn't athletic. However, that is far from the truth, even at the amateur level, let alone that elite level. Professionals train with strength coaches and dedicate their lives to mastering difficult skills just like every other sport or game imaginable. The demands of generating 450 plus RPMs on a 15 or 16 pound ball going upwards of 17 miles an hour and hitting incredibly small targets is immense, especially when you factor that in to how that can affect someone when they compete on the biggest stages. These are all the qualities of a legitimate Olympic sport. Then we have to talk about level playing field. Unlike many other Olympic sports, where success stems from access to the best facilities and years of specialized training from childhood, bowling is by far the most accessible. A kid in Japan has the exact same opportunity to build and develop world-class skills as a kid in Michigan. The equipment costs may be expensive for the average person, but on the scale of the Olympic Games, it only sits in the middle, being far less expensive than some others like equestrian. The bar to entry is very low, and the sport is usually very cheap to learn. You have potential to one day reach the next level where the costs cover themselves, at least in a global sense. Next, let's take a look at infrastructure, because this is a big selling point for the Olympics. A lot of sports require the host city to build specialized venues that are left to rot after the games end. Bowling alleys already exist in almost every potential host city. The infrastructure is already here, and there are plenty of events in the PBA where a pair of lanes has even been constructed outside the context of a bowling alley. So technically speaking, it doesn't even have to be in an existing bowling alley. Adding bowling would hardly cost anything for the host cities. Lastly, television compatibility and simple, understandable rules. Bowling is probably one of the easier sports to understand. It already has a history of great broadcasts, and has a natural tension that escalates as the stepladder goes on. You don't have to understand a complex scoring system or subjective judging criteria like you see in things like free skating, for example. The ball just hits pins, pins fall down, score goes up. Sure, there's a little bit of variance with what a strike and what a spare does, But doesn't every sport have some sort of scoring potential in that kind of way? The stepladder, like I mentioned earlier, already has that natural escalating tension as the event moves on. The sport and the format have proven themselves time and time again over decades of EBT and PBA telecasts. So, if bowling checks all these boxes, why isn't it in the Olympics? What is the real problem? Well, the official reasons given for bowling's exclusion give a much clearer picture of why it isn't included, because checking off boxes on paper doesn't always translate perfectly to what's practical. The competition in developing nations is the main argument. While bowling is played all around the world, the highest levels of bowling are concentrated in mainly the wealthier nations, like the United States, or Europe, or Eastern Asia. The Olympic Committee argues that younger people in these third world countries can't develop skills needed to compete anywhere near the highest level. Think about how little bowling alleys exist in Africa compared to, let's say, the Midwest of the United States, or South Korea, or Japan. Clearly, there's a big difference. But there's a big hole in this argument. The exact same thing is true for several sports already in the Olympics. All these equestrian sports require access to horses and specialized facilities that are usually not cheap. Sailing requires access to boats and bodies of water, obviously. Golf requires golf courses, expensive clubs, expensive coaching, and is honestly the closest direct comparison to bowling. Even the core Olympic sports, like gymnastics, require years of coaching and facility use that most developing nations have trouble getting. The difference is that those sports have a long-standing Olympic history. Bowling does not. So that barrier to entry is applied selectively. Bowling doesn't have a legacy required to get it in the games. While it may be true that climate-controlled environments are required, think about literally any bowling alley you've ever been in. For the vast majority of places around the globe that have bowling alleys, you are able to walk into one and it will not be blazing hot or freezing cold in a way that would mess up the actual physical alley. And then, looking at the expensive side of things, look at the elephant in the room. Building an Olympic aquatic center costs way more than installing a pair of bowling lanes. Constructing a ski jump or an equestrian course probably 10x more than building a pair of bowling lanes, or a center, I guess. And then the real elephant in the room, the perceived lack of athleticism. There's a perception among the Olympic Committee and a lot of other people that bowling does not meet the standards of other Olympic events. But even though it faces those same physical challenges as several other traditionally athletic sports, the image problem persists among both committee members and the general public, the people who would tune in and watch bowling. Another issue with bowling is the age demographic. Bowling skews significantly older than many of the other sports. It's seen as something your parents do in a league or your old neighbor does on a weekend. This perception is by far the biggest obstacle that the sport faces when talking about inclusion in the Olympic Games. There are also limited slots. The Olympics only have so many resources and so many spots for games before they become impossible or financially unsustainable. Every sport added means another sport is removed or another event fighting over limited resources. The reason they continue to add sports like climbing and skateboarding is because they believe that these demographics are what the Olympics need if they want to keep going. Bowling competes against these sports with better lobbying efforts, younger participants, and better marketing. When you're fighting for one of the last available slots and you're up against sports backed by massive corporations and cultural relevancy beyond older generations, you are far behind in the eyes of the Olympic Committee. And then there's another problem. A lot of bowling's game is based on the bowling balls you're throwing and the lane conditions, so what material it's made out of. if it's oiled heavy, what pattern is on there. This is completely fine to people who understand bowling, but to those, maybe you if you're watching this video, who might not understand bowling, this pattern can make no sense and be hard to explain on TV. So what is the aftermath of all this? How have people kept pushing? Well, after Seoul, we didn't give up. In 2015, bowling made the shortlist for inclusion in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. The sport was one of 8 finalists considered for addition. The petition from over 1 million Japanese bowling fans also demonstrated that public interest. The case for bowling's inclusion remained extremely solid, even after all those nitpicks from the International Olympic Committee. But in September, the bad news came in. Bowling was not included. Sport climbing, skateboarding, surfing, karate, and baseball softball were all in. Bowling was left out, along with wushu and squash. The sports that were added were those that the Olympic Committee believed would align best with Tokyo's vision for the Games. Bowling just wasn't seen as having the same level of cultural relevancy or youth appeal as all of those others. World Bowling has continued making bids for Olympic inclusion. The organization keeps refining its proposals, addressing the concerns, and demonstrating growth in developing nations. Yet, those obstacles still remain in the path of its Olympic inclusion. Since 2020, it was missing again in 2024, and 2028 in Los Angeles doesn't have any bowling in its current program and likely won't. 2032 in Brisbane hasn't announced anything either. At some point, you've got to ask whether the Olympic dream is actually doable, or whether we're just chasing something that will never happen. While bowling's Olympic hopes have repeatedly been shot down, it's found several homes elsewhere, and it might be fine after all. It's been an official sport at every single World Games since 1981. The World Games are another international multi-sport event designed for sports outside of the Olympics, so not included. They're held once every 4 years, 1 year after the Summer Olympics, and they feature the best athletes in non-Olympic sports, all competing for their respective world championships. Bowling finally proved that it could deliver competition beyond the mainstream PBA, EBT, and JPBA. It could succeed in these multi-competition events. And then came a shocking development that changed everything. The 2025 World Games in China dropped bowling for the very first time. After being part of every single past World Games, bowling was suddenly off the menu. The removal from the 2025 Games was a devastating blow to bowling's international presence, and it raised a ton of questions about bowling's place in non-Olympic multi-sport events. Thankfully, bowling has continued at the Pan American Games, where the sport has had full medal status since 1991, been part of the Asian Games, where sport has been featured since 1978, and it's also appeared in various other multi-sport events all across the globe. The sport has also gained recognition from the International Paralympic Committee as of 2022, opening the door for potential Paralympic inclusion in the future. So, bowling exists in this strange space. It's a competitive sport that's played internationally with governing bodies, world championships, and participation across the entire globe. But the sport exists entirely outside the Olympic Games. This means that the sport exists outside the spotlight that every global sport competes for. In the end, the Olympics make decisions based on what will attract viewers and what will keep the games relevant to the next generation. Bowling isn't seen as one of the sports contributing towards those goals in the ways that they want. And this might be fine. Bowling doesn't need the Olympics to survive, and it never has, and it likely never will. The sport has been an established system of various tours, international competition, and participation all around the world for decades. Bowling survives and occasionally thrives outside the Olympic structure, but there's no denying what Olympic inclusion could mean for the sport. The media exposure, the prestige, the outside relevance that stems from participation, sports that make the Olympics get big government funding. They get the big corporate sponsorships. They have youth programs developed, and a public attention that non-Olympic sports never get. Bowling had its lone shot in Seoul and couldn't convert it. Whether this is because the sport wasn't ready, the timing was wrong, or because the Olympics simply couldn't structure it, the result is still the same. One demonstration event 37 years ago, one chance to prove it belonged, and then the dream was dying. But the dream isn't completely gone. World Bowling keeps trying year after year, and advocates keep pushing. But with every cycle that passes without inclusion, the chances get smaller and smaller. Sports added in the last decade have started to cement their places. A lot of newer upcoming sports are competing for attention. Bowling has been stuck in the past for nearly 4 decades. So we're left with a sport that has everything but the status. Global participation, we have established competition, we have athletics, we have the infrastructure, everything except the gold, silver, and bronze medals and the 5 Olympic rings. That is the story of bowling at the Olympics. A sport that did everything right and still failed to deliver, and a dream that's been put aside for so long the dream might never see the light of day. They gave everything they had, but it wasn't enough. 37 years later, bowling is the sport that failed the Olympics. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comment section below, and leave a like and subscribe so we can hit 30K before the end of the year. Do you think bowling will ever be included in the Olympic Games? Do you think it will ever grow to the point where that's possible? Or do you think bowling will slowly get less and less recognition? Our dream is still alive, let's hope that it can happen one day. But that's about all I've got time for today, so I'll see you guys next time.